That'd be super. Are you there?
I am here, loud and clear. Nice to speak with you, Michael.
Good morning. Good morning, Mark. Okay, so lots of conversations this morning around the pace and the sense of risk and high stakes decision making, Mark. Not only for the well-being of the workforce and the sustainability of the organizations, but also because the people on the call are leading organizations that serve children, young people and communities, and right at the front line of the current crisis. So what we're looking forward to today from this conversation is to talk about leading through times of high risk, high pressure and at pace, but doing so in a way that kind of prepares us for the futures as well, and best places us for the future. So it's great to have you with us this morning. Just to introduce Mark is an expert and a former senior executive in the world of Formula One motor racing and international motorsport. And Mark worked with both Red Bull Racing and Jordan Grand Prix as a senior executive, and now tours the world supporting the Formula One circus, Mark, but also advising teams and advising people that work in the sport, as well as working with businesses outside the sport to learn some of the lessons from leadership and how it all works. So good morning.
Good morning. Great pleasure to be able to join you today, and hi to everyone.
So Mark, the first question I'm going to ask is about your background. Really, I've touched on it briefly, but how did you become so involved at a strategic level in Formula One teams? Many of whom are household names.
Well, I think like anyone, when you reach the top of your profession, you look back and realize that you've been on a journey really since childhood, and there have been lots of twists and turns on that route. But if you have a passion for what you do, inevitably there will have been moments during your life when you realize that passion is really what kicked in and ultimately led to you getting to where you are today. And for me, of course, as a young child growing up, I grew up in Northern Ireland, and I fell in love with motorsport as a sport that I enjoyed watching on TV. But actually, it was really only during my university degree course, I did economics and business management, that I began to really think about how I could work in this industry. And when I graduated from Queen's University in 1983, I saw a job advertised for Autosport, which is the principal magazine for motor racing in the UK, and I applied for that job, much to my parents' I think probably disgust as well as amazement, and then I got that role, and really that began a sequence of events where I initially worked in the media in Formula One, but my interest in business, which had really been established during my university degree, never left me. So I became really interested in the business side of this multi-billion-dollar sport and how it worked commercially and how teams operated as businesses rather than as sports teams. It was obviously the sporting dimension is very clear with the racing on 20 or 22 Sundays across the season, but actually it's a 365-day a year business. So I went very quickly from working in the media to working with two of the very largest commercial sponsors. I was a consultant for Philip Morris back in the days when tobacco sponsorship was permitted, and also Canon, who sponsored Nigel Mansell's team. And if you're old enough to remember Nigel Mansell, he drove for the Canon Williams team. So I worked with Canon, and I started doing, therefore, a lot of work with these very large multinational companies to understand how they structured their global marketing around Formula One, but also working with people like Nigel Mansell and other drivers and meeting team principals. And so really back in my 20s, I broke through in terms of building a great network, a formidable network. And that then led to me meeting Eddie Jordan, who was setting up a Formula One team, a startup Formula One team. And he brought me in as head of communications. And then a few years after we had entered Formula One as a small team, I was promoted to the position of marketing director, and I joined the management board. at Jordan, and then everything really else flowed on from there. So I spent almost a decade and a half at Jordan Grand Prix. I then joined Red Bull Racing at a time when they had really were transitioning their business away from being Jaguar. So Jaguar Formula One team was sold to Red Bull. And I finished my executive career actually not in a team, but at Cosworth. And again, some of the delegates here may remember the name Cosworth. It used to be part of Ford Motor Company. We used to make very fast Ford Escorts and Ford Sierras. And I led the Cosworth Formula One engine program in Formula One up until 2012. So that's providing engines and electronics and software and control systems technology. And actually, one way or another, I think we had customers in every single Formula One team, even Ferrari used some of our software. So that was kind of that's when my executive career kind of reached its pinnacle, I suppose, in terms of my management responsibilities. There were 300 staff there at Cosworth, all engaged one way or another in the Formula One program, and it was an extremely rewarding and demanding time. And I think rather pertinent to your meeting today, although I was notionally kind of managing director of Cosworth Formula One, thinking about it, really, I was a COO. I was head of operations. I reported to the CEO of Cosworth Group, and it was my job to deliver operationally for the business, as I say, 365 days a year.
And as you've touched on, Mark, it's a big sport. At its core, it employs 10,000 people in the United Kingdom, but on the periphery, many more than that are working to supply the industry and support the industry, and with revenues of billions of pounds a year. But as with academy trusts and the organisations we're talking about, where at the front line it's the business of teaching and learning, it's the best educational experience possible for children and young people. Behind the scenes, there's significant support and different aspects to making that work to the very best it can do. And I'm interested to know, behind, you talked about those 22 races a year, and the thing that we all see as a public on the television, 2 hours every other Sunday afternoon. Could you describe a little bit the complexities of running a Formula One team and what's involved in the background? So as a chief operating officer of a Formula One team, you know, the 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon are a very, very small part of the package, aren't they?
Exactly. And I think for all of your colleagues here on the call, they will understand the following sentence. You know, what people outside your sector see, so the public facing bit of what you do, really doesn't in any way reflect the work that goes on behind the scenes to make it all happen. There's a huge amount that has to go into delivering programs and be the wonderful kind of programs that all of you are involved in, or whether it's a program like I've been involved in, which is putting on a major sporting spectacle. There is really no, I think there's very little understanding of just how small the tip of the iceberg really is, and just how big it is below the surface. So Formula One teams, typically we employ anywhere up to about 1,000 full-time staff. So when you mentioned 10,000 employees in the UK, there are 8 Formula One teams either headquartered or with major operations here in the UK, all of them actually within a 60-minute radius of where I'm sitting near Oxford. So really the M40 is the Silicon Valley of Formula One. And those teams include companies like McLaren, which have diversified their activities, and we can talk about that a little bit later on. So McLaren, of course, has an automotive business, and they employ many thousands of people. So the smallest team based here in the UK would be the Haas Formula One team based in Banbury. They employ actually only less than a couple of hundred people, because they work to quite a different business model from everyone else. So you're looking at anywhere between a couple of hundred and several thousand people working for the team. And in order to make the whole show happen, first of all, we have to take a big step back and say, well, what is it that we do? What is it that we do? So everyone thinks, well, you know, they just go motor racing. actually, we're a technology company. We have to design and manufacture a product and bring that product to market. It so happens that the product that we have to design and manufacture is a Formula One racing car. We are given an incredibly short amount of time to design and develop the car, because essentially the regulations change every year. I'm very happy to talk about regulation and compliance if you want to, because it's pretty close to my heart. But essentially, the regulations change every year because our sport is fundamentally dangerous, and the regulator likes to manage the risk by trying to slow us down. And then we employ many hundreds of engineers who spend all their time trying to make the cars go faster. So it's a constant kind of push-pull in terms of the risk management. So we have to bring a new product to market every year. Typically, it's a kind of 6-7 month program from June, July through to December to get a new car designed, manufactured, brought to market. January is all about passing the final regulatory checks, safety checks, which are mandatory. And if you fail any of those compliance checks, you're not permitted to compete. And that's a very binary outcome in terms of compliance and regulatory control. If we fail those safety tests, we are not permitted to run that racing car, and we're essentially out of business. So our very bright engineers are trying to make a car that's lightweight and fast and, you know, technologically innovative and all those great things, which are wonderful. But if in their enthusiasm to produce something that's a little bit different and a little bit innovative, they actually breach the safety regulations, well, then we're in a heap of pain. So that, again, it's all about the balances that need to be achieved. Once we have passed our regulatory checks, we can complete the final build on the car. We do around about 6 or 8 days pre-season testing in February of each year, and then we all head off down to Australia for the first Grand Prix of the season. And when I say we head down to Australia, what I mean is that, so if you have 1,000 full-time staff in a Formula One team, about 120 of your colleagues will go to every race. That means that almost 900 of our staff do not travel to events. Rather cheekily, they're referred to as back office. Well, I'm sorry, there's 90% of our employees, so it's a lot more than back office.
I think people will relate to that.
Yeah,
certainly.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, Michael? I mean, there's the kind of front of house people, and then there's the people that you don't see. And as I say, almost 90% of the people who work in Formula One simply work in a factory, which if you work for Red Bull Racing, it means you work in a factory in Milton Keynes. That's about as sexy as it gets for them, working in Milton Keynes. So it's so you've got to send those 120 people to the race with the cars, with all the equipment. It's about, depending on which team you're dealing with, they can be taken up to 50 tons of equipment. So that's across the 10 teams, about 500 tons of equipment. And then Formula One freights a lot of its own equipment around, particularly the TV broadcast village. So it's, 600 tons of equipment to a different country every week, every fortnight. Lots of people. It's like being in the ultimate circus, quite frankly. And from an operational standpoint, the logistics is probably the least sexy thing, and it's a thing that therefore the media very seldom ask us any questions about. Certainly the thing that the fans don't ever really think about. But for me, from an operational standpoint, the logistical delivery, actually being in the right place at the right time with the right specification of components, becomes the core focus for the organization. Because whether we win or lose on a Sunday afternoon in a motor race, the fact is, as a business, we have to deliver operationally every single weekend. So actually, in point of fact, all the teams are extremely good at what they are. Extremely good at what they do.
Because he said.
Okay, I think we have someone that's just come off mute, Mark. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I know that's what they're saying, but we're doing it as we do it.
If we can.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, there we go. Mark, I'm really interested in this point around regulation and compliance, because I think for the education sector at the moment, but actually for every sector at the moment, there is this tension between a regulator, and let's call them government. In our case, it's the Department for Education, but it could be other aspects of government as well, that have to set these health and safety parameters, as it were, at the moment, about returning to work, reopening our organisations, and so on. And on the other hand, the pressure on the people in this call and others to deliver, to perform, and to get back to work and start delivering again under pressure from their workforce, but also communities and so on. So in a situation where we have this quite vague but very, very important need for regulation, and the regulation isn't quite coming quickly enough because of the changing circumstances, and people are feeling the pressure to get on, deliver, perform, and so on. Big risk that if we move too soon with that, so in the case of schools returning back to school, there's huge risk in moving too soon with that before there's real clarity from the regulator. But of course, we've got professional people who are public service minded, who are looking at their communities thinking, you know, we need to be ready, and we need to perform as well as we can. So I don't know if you've got any advice around you know, vague regulations and how we prepare for them. And I know in Formula One you're about to go through regulatory change, but that's all quite vague at the moment, and teams are wondering how to spend their money and plan.
Well, actually, I mean, there isn't just a direct parallel. In fact, we're all in the same situation, because at the moment there is no Formula One. We have 10 teams and 200 suppliers who have been expected to press the pause button. Lots of staff who have been furloughed. Operations have been called to a halt, and there is nothing but uncertainty, because none of us have a crystal ball that is accurate enough to tell us when it will be safe to return to normal business. And actually, from the perspective of normal business, what are we talking about? Well, in the case of Formula One, we're talking about global travel, and probably the last thing to be completely normalized again will be global travel, because the days of packed aircraft and large volumes of flights are probably gone for certainly some months and possibly some years, which is why the aviation industry is undergoing, I mean, not just a correction, they're probably undergoing the worst crisis in the history of aviation, with companies like Airbus actually talking about their very survival being at stake, because quite frankly, no one's flying. When we go back to flying, we won't have the volume of flights, and airlines are not going to need new aircraft. So all their order book is going to face a lot of cancellations in the years ahead. So what we're really seeing is, in Formula One, us having the same problem. Our staff want to go back to work. The fans want us to go back to work. Our customers, which are our sponsors, our fans, the broadcasters who broadcast Formula One. So if you take Sky Sports, for example, Sky Sports spend a huge amount of money to broadcast Formula One. They have a dedicated channel to Formula One. At the moment, they can't show anything from the 2020 season, so they're having to show reruns of previous years. So the reality is our whole sector has had the pause button pressed, and this is not an easy moment. Now, what can we do? Well, what we can do is we can make decisions based on what we can control. And for example, in the case of Formula One, the kind of things that have happened are as follows. Every August, we have a mandatory 2-week shutdown, a mandatory 2-week holiday. I won't bore you with the reasons why that is mandatory, but anyway, we have a mandatory 2-week shutdown every August, and it applies to all the Formula One teams. That shutdown was brought forward. And that shutdown was brought forward to coincide with this period of uncertainty with the lockdown. The 2 weeks was then extended to 3 weeks by the regulator. The 3 weeks was then extended to 5 weeks. You might say, well, what's the benefit of that? Well, the benefit of that is that we're essentially restructuring our business so that we are front loading the elements that we have control over, in terms of people taking a break from routine, in terms of our factory shutdown, also in terms of factory maintenance. So there is some maintenance going on at our factories that is normally done in August, but is now being done in April and May, because we are actually permitted to do that maintenance work, because in many cases it involves individuals doing maintenance work, so social distancing isn't a major issue. So we've really thought about how we can restructure our year in order to bring forward things that really we are allowed to do despite the lockdown. Then the second thing we're doing is we are constantly planning week by week when we can restart. Now, initially, when the first race of the season was cancelled in Australia, everyone was thinking this will be 4 weeks. Then people said, oh, well, actually, it might be longer, it might be 6 weeks. Those of us who I think maybe we're standing back a little bit further and looking at the big picture, and frankly reading avidly lots of sources of information from other industries and from governments, not just the UK government, but other governments around the world, because we are a global sport. We began to realize this is going to run and run and run, because essentially countries are going to be hit by the virus at different points in time, and each country will have a different way of tackling it. So you've got Sweden, which, for example, didn't have a big lockdown. They had one approach. We're seeing what's happening in the United States at the moment. We know that Brazil is beginning to see the virus really take off in a significant way. Japan seemed to be able to delay the virus for some time. Actually, they were too complacent, and then it's finally really affected them. So what we're seeing is different countries around the world being affected at different points in times. So harmonization of approach is clearly going to be very difficult. So where we are now, 6 weeks down the road, is we have no racing for March, April, May, June. So that's 4 months of curtailment of operations. The Austrian government has just this week announced that we can have a Grand Prix there at the beginning of July, as long as there are no spectators, and as long as everyone attending from the teams and from the organizing authorities are restricted in their numbers. So we will only bring a minimum number of people, and everyone who travels will be expected to have gone through a COVID-19 test, so that there will be as much security around the way in which that event is happening. And so that looks like a little bit of a focal point now for us. Austria, beginning of July. And then essentially what Formula One is planning to do is, instead of tearing off around the globe, trying to go back to a normal routine, what we're actually thinking of doing is having multiple races. So possibly 2 races at the same track in Austria, possibly 2 races at Silverstone. Again, not having any fans at the British Grand Prix. And of course, the British Grand Prix will only take place behind closed doors if the Department of Culture and Sport, Culture, Media and Sport approves that. And at the moment, they're incredibly supportive, because the Department of Culture, Media and Sport realizes Formula One is a big business with a lot of employers who really want to take their staff off furlough and get back to normal. So we're beginning to see a picture develop where, we will probably stay in Europe until the early autumn, possibly having multiple races at the same venue. So our TV broadcasters are happy, our sponsors will be getting publicity, our fans will have something to watch on TV, and then we will head off around the world, but only to countries which are happy to accommodate us. And again, certain countries have expressed a specific interest in having Formula One visit later on this year. So we have optimism that we will have a world championship. But what it all comes back to, Michael, is there's a lot of stuff that we have no control over. And while it may be frustrating, there's nothing we can do about that. So we have to focus on the things that we can control, and we have to therefore communicate with our people so that they're fully up to date with all the thought processes that are going on, even if we don't have answers to all of the questions, and then have a plan A and a plan B and a plan C for when things start to get back to some degree of normality. And it's only by having that phased approach that I think we can gear up for, hopefully, the day in not too many weeks' time when we're told that we can return to our operations.
We've spoken a lot this morning, Mark, about the circle of control, and for leaders and organizations to be very, very mindful of the moment of what they can control, what they can influence and they can do, and actually being very clear about what they can't. And that's going to keep us all healthy and in a good state of mind, but it's also going to allow us to use our time wisely and not be chasing our tail. I think the media and our communities and so on, of course, there's kind of a more visible pressure from the media. Communities less visible, but of course, people want to get back to normal life, and you mentioned the fans in Formula One. And of course, leaders want to be in control. They want to make those decisions and move forward. And there's a real tension here. I'm interested in what you're talking about, the proposed dates and the return to Grand Prix racing as we think about the return to normal life in our organisations. And much of what you've said is still aspirational, isn't it? I mean, there's some a little bit to hang on to, some proposed dates, some proposed venues. But how far, what sense do you get in terms of how far the teams are planning and what level they're planning to so for example, if you think about Formula One, they've got to get their people over there, they've got to book flights, hotel venues, get the sponsors signed up for attending the races, get the drivers ready and fit and so on. How much are they, to what detail of planning are they going into in response to these aspirational comments from the sports and the regulators, but also still, you know, there's no firm decision, understandably, because we can't make those.
Well, as I say, there really is a plan A, B, and C. So plan A at the moment is we start racing in Austria. So at the moment, all the teams who have logistics staff working from home, they're already actually making the necessary bookings for that race. And actually that race, the Austrian Grand Prix, its date will not have changed. So actually it would be very nice to kick off with an event that was already in our established plan. So that's great. But if we have a second Austrian Grand Prix, it means they're staying there. So again, all the teams are planning for that. And so that plan A is very much now what everyone is working on. But of course, then plan B is if a second wave of the coronavirus starts to hit Europe over the summer, which is of course everyone's biggest fear, then it's not impossible to imagine the Australian and UK governments saying you can't have a race even behind closed doors. So plan B becomes a preparation to cancel and postpone again, and then to refocus into the autumn. So lots of uncertainty. What I can tell you is that all 10 Formula One team bosses and the president of the sports governing body and the chief executive of Formula One itself, so those 12 chief executives, are in daily communication. And they are then cascading the results of their meetings, which have been conducted online, down to their COOs and all of the operational people. But here's the key thing, is that the leadership of our sector are maintaining day-to-day communication and collaboration, because this is a sector-wide problem. So we're not interested in Ferrari having a fantastic plan to return to work and McLaren having a bad plan to return to work. We need everyone to have the same excellent plan to return to work, because we all want to operate to the highest level. And we have long since learned in Formula One that when it comes to managing risks, particularly existential risks to our businesses, the best way that we can behave is to come together as a sector and keep those communications flowing. Because if the boss of Ferrari hears something from the Italian Prime Minister, he can share that with all of the rest of us. That can then be something that we kick into the Department of Culture, Media and Sport and say, well, the Italians are telling us the following. And what we're trying to do is, we're in the absence of, you know, cohesive plans coming from the governments, we're trying to encourage the decision making. And I want to come back to a point that you mentioned, which is, you know, you mentioned the media, and you know, Formula One is very much a media sport. And I've done a lot of work and still do a lot of work in the media. We all, and I really mean we all, have a big problem with the way the media today operates. The media operates entirely on the basis of a blame culture and entirely on the basis of pitching one side against the other. And it's incredibly unhelpful at this moment in time, because this is not a crisis that anyone in our society created. It is an external event which has overwhelmed the globe, and no one can possibly be expected to have had all of the answers, no matter how much we might want to finger point about the way the coronavirus has been dealt with by governments around the world in different ways and in different shapes and sizes. The fact of the matter is, this is a pandemic of extraordinary proportions and rapidity in terms of how it has come upon us. So the media are it's actually very unhelpful. And by the media, I include social media, because if I go onto social media, I see people complaining about the fact there's no Formula One racing. I can see people complaining about that their jobs might be at risk in Formula One. I see people complaining about all kinds of things. I don't really see the benefit, because this is not something that anyone has set out to create as a strategy. This is an event that has overtaken us. So we all that we can do is use our best endeavors. So in many ways, the media for us, it isn't that helpful, because they will pressure us into trying to make decisions which, if we listen to them too much, can lead to a knee-jerk. And we don't need knee-jerk. We need planned, compassionate thinking, which is focused on health and safety and well-being of everyone. And so for the senior people in Formula One, the 10 team principals, the head of the regulator, the head of Formula One, the overwhelming focus is on safety, health, and well-being, not only of our own employees and suppliers, but of the population at large. And therefore, any decision we make has to be framed against what is right to do in the face of a global pandemic. And if we jump too soon, exactly to your point, if we jump too soon, if Formula One car racing were to kick off in Austria in July, and as a result of that, we created a localized second wave, it would turn out to have been the worst decision we ever made. So we will not do that. We can't afford to take those risks. And for me, on our risk register, that's our biggest concern at the moment, has to be that because of external pressure, be it from media or fans or the general public or customers, whatever, that because of external pressures, we feel forced into doing something which we will then later regret. Part of being a leader is taking tough decisions. And for us, the toughest decision to take at the moment is to remain patient.
Yeah, a great point, Mark. And I think that will be reassuring for everyone on the call. And in this era of speculation and noise, and I think, there are some people out there that aren't so busy, and the social media provides a chance to vent. Of course, the media is rushing to get the clicks and sell the papers and so on. And I think leaders feel very much caught in that. And we're almost back to the circle of control, really, which is, where are you in control? Where are you most comfortable? And actually stick to what you feel is the right thing to do. And it's having the courage, I think, in these circumstances to do that. I want to move on, if we can, just to talk a little bit about leadership now, and particularly some of the examples of leadership in Formula One that we can perhaps learn from during this crisis. We've got about half an hour left. The first thing is I want to ask about some of the high-profile people in the sport, and again, household names who are at the front and centre stage, and we're well aware of them in the media. Probably the most successful and visible leader in Formula One over the last half a century or so has been Bernie Ecclestone, and I'm interested to learn a little bit about his leadership style. And of course, he's not around at the moment, and it'd be interesting to know your thoughts on how he would have responded to this situation. But again, those figureheads are supported by people who are good operational leaders, effective operational leaders, who tend to hang around and stay loyal. So I'm interested to hear a little bit about that chief exec relationship with those perhaps a little behind the scenes, but who make things tick.
Well, the common trait amongst all successful leaders in Formula One is that they employ the very best people they can and then empower them to deliver. And really, it's more of an adaptive leadership style, where you set the vision and you then bring the talent in, and you give the talent the opportunity to thrive. And it's not about command and control. It's about coaching and mentoring and intervention when there's problems, and being willing to, not just willing, but actually encouraging people to come to you for assistance and guidance. So that becomes for me, the most successful style of leadership. Bernie Ecclestone is someone who you specifically mentioned, and it'll come as no surprise to people to know that he had much more of an autocratic, some would say dictatorial style of leadership, and that maybe command and control was his way. I'm not sure that's the case. I mean, he certainly had quite an autocratic style. He didn't mind that people feared him, but actually, when you went into battle with him, or I used to think of it as going into battle with him, I never found him difficult to deal with. In fact, what he wanted to do is he wanted to get all the right information. He wanted to make decisions quickly. He was very succinct, very concise, and actually, my overwhelming experience of dealing with him was that I gained a very solid insight into what had made him so successful. He was a leader of action. He was a leader of delivery. He was a leader who empowered people, and he had superb lieutenants. He had superb operating managers at every level, whether it was the television operation for Formula One, or the corporate hospitality, or the sponsorship, or or the logistics side. He had key lieutenants who ran those aspects, those functions of the business, and he really let them crack on with it. And he saw it as his role to support them. And then if you look at the other leaders that we've worked with in Formula One, people like Frank Williams, who founded and owns the Williams Formula One team, or Ron Dennis, who really was responsible for creating the giant business that McLaren has become to get today. Again, they all had very similar approaches, even if their personalities were different. From a leadership perspective, they had a real vision of where they wanted to get to, and they knew that it was about marshalling the resources in the right way, spending every pound that they could in the right way, and having the best people to rely upon to deliver for them. So actually, lots of different personalities, but very, very similar attributes. And the final person who I will mention to you, because his team happens to be the dominant team in Formula One at the moment, is Toto Wolff, who runs the Mercedes-Benz Formula One team. Lewis Hamilton, of course, drives for them, and Lewis has won 6 Formula One World Championships, 5 of them for the Mercedes-Benz team, which is based in Brackley in Northamptonshire. Now, Toto Wolff is Austrian. He's chief executive of the team. He lives in Oxford. His office, as I said, is in Brackley. And Toto has given a couple of great interviews to the BBC. I think one in July last year and one at the end of last season. And those 2 interviews for me read like a leadership textbook, because he's asked specifically to explain how he has unlocked such capability in the Mercedes-Benz team. Now, again, from outsiders will think, well, Mercedes-Benz wins in Formula One because they have more money than everyone else, or a bigger factory, or German engineering, or some such thing. All of this is nonsense. We have seen many, many, many examples in Formula One of big car companies failing miserably. People like BMW and famously Toyota, who spent $2.5 billion on Formula One and never won a single Grand Prix. So it's not about your size or your scale or how much money you throw at it. It's actually about people and organization and leadership. And Toto has brought a very distinct style of leadership to Mercedes-Benz. He drives a culture of continuous improvement. He drives a culture of measurement. Everyone knows they're being measured, but they're not being measured so that they can be blamed when they don't deliver. They're being measured so that they actually can be encouraged to constantly improve and to pressure the leadership to help them to constantly improve. Toto drives a team who are obsessed with how can we do better every day. And so if people make a mistake, they put their hand up and admit it straight away. If people need more support, they ask for that support. If the team suffers a failure, they all sit down together and they say, how did we as a team fail in this operation? What can we do to improve next weekend? So that incredibly positive culture of empowerment and of delivery and of constant review about how we're performing, how can we do better, that has enabled Mercedes-Benz not only to win in Formula One, but to sustain their successful performance year after year after year. And frankly, I don't see them being beaten anytime soon, as long as the other teams fail culturally in terms of their leadership and the way in which the people are marshaled and operated.
Thanks, Mark. No, really insightful, and that insatiable need for success, and that has been sustained really over 6 years at Mercedes, and the culture there, really, it does seem quite formidable at the moment. And if those people remain in post, Toto and others, you, as you say, you can only see that continuing. I want to move on, if we can, just a little bit back to uncertainty, and crisis and unprecedented are 2 words being used regularly at the moment. the 1st of May tomorrow, and Formula One, that's a big day in the history of Formula One as a sport, had its crisis in 1994. Ended up on the front page of almost every national newspaper following the deaths of Ayrton Senna and Roland Ratzenberger at Imola. And the future of the sport was brought into real question. I'm really keen to get a sense. Can you tell us about what happened and how the leaders of the sport responded in that crisis, where its future was really called into question?
So you're quite right. 26 years ago today, Roland Ratzenberger lost his life during qualifying for the San Marino Grand Prix. Roland was a good friend of mine. And then the following day, on Sunday, the 1st of May, Ayrton Senna lost his life while leading the San Marino Grand Prix. And he lost his life live on television. I mean, let's be clear about it. And that was in itself something that led to change, because when Formula One drivers were killed in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, generally speaking, the races were not being broadcast live. They certainly weren't being broadcast globally. And so we didn't see death and injury live on television. But on May the 1st, 1994, we had live global broadcasting. There was no delay in the transmission. So the images that were broadcast were completely live. That is no longer the case. So any of you listening who currently pay for a live TV subscription for live sports on television, you should know that Formula One delays the feed by between 5 and 10 seconds, so that if we ever see anything unsavory on the live feed, we can actually cut that before television viewers around the world are ever exposed to the images of the kind that we saw when Ayrton Senna lost his life. Now, in the wake of those two fatalities, our whole industry was in crisis. We had the human tragedy, we had the emotion of losing not only the greatest talent that a generation had seen, but also a young up-and-coming talent in Roland Ratzenberger. There was the emotional impact on all of the people involved. I mean, quite frankly, to a post-traumatic stress level of emotion for people directly working with those people because of what they witnessed and then had to deal with in the aftermath of those fatal accidents. And I remember the following morning being interviewed on CNBC television, the business channel, and the journalist asking me, was this the end of Formula One? Because no one's going to want to sponsor a sport which, frankly, kills people live on television, and this is surely untenable. So there was a real sense of crisis, and I'm pleased you asked me the question about that, because again, it came down to what the leadership was going to do. Now we so easily could have done what lots of organizations and sectors do, and said, well, we'll have a report and we'll have a committee meeting, and there'll be a full report published at the end of the year, and look back on what changes need to be made. That's not what happened. What happened was that Bernie Ecclestone, as chief executive of Formula One, and Max Mosley, who was president of the governing body, the FIA, they sat down with all the Formula One team bosses, and they said, we cannot have this happen ever again. And they quickly put together a team of people that week, and those people sat down and looked at every subsequent Formula One race venue, and they identified all the high-risk corners where a car could crash, and they immediately began the process of asking all of the venues to change those circuits before we ever went to them. So instead of having some report 6 months down the line, within 6 days, we had a whole series of actions being put in place to prevent a reoccurrence. Now, Max Mosley is remembered in the UK for very different reasons than his pioneering work in the face of that tragic sequence of events in San Marino. But I can promise you that Max Mosley's legacy in Formula One was that, as the regulator, he set a target of 0 fatalities from that date onwards. And the amazing thing is he achieved it, because 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years went past following those accidents in which we never had another Formula One driver fatality. We had 40 plus driver fatalities in 45 years, and then we had none for the next 20. And that was all down to Max's leadership, Bernie's leadership, and the way everyone placed safety at the center of our day-to-day operations. And the moment everyone realized that safety was now our number one priority, not in talking the talk, but actually walking the walk of safety, making it our priority, everything changed. So the cultural shift within the industry was immediate. And as a result, we saw ultimately what became a fantastic outcome with safety dramatically improved. Safety equipment, safety regulations, safety training, cultural behaviors amongst the teams, the way in which operations were run so that we would call a halt to operations if we saw risks being increased. It became a really positive outcome in the end. Sad to report that 21 years after those fatalities, we did have another fatal accident, and that was Jules Bianchi, who died subsequently as a result of a brain injury sustained at the Japanese Grand Prix at the end of 2014. And actually, that tragic event reminded everyone, if we needed reminding, of why we had undergone such rigor over the previous 20 years. That subsequent event reminded us that we're never entirely out of the woods in terms of how we can manage health, safety, and well-being. And so for a new generation of people within our industry, it reminded them of just why it is that safety is so important. So my hope now is that we will have another 20, 30, maybe 40 years before we ever have a reoccurrence again. But the most important takeaway was that Max Mosley, Bernie Ecclestone, immediately from a leadership point of view, set the tone and the direction of travel for how we were going to move forward in the wake of that crisis. And that leadership really, I mean, I have to say, to this day, leaves a fabulous legacy.
I think what we're going to see through this particular crisis, Mark, is organisations rethink how they, particularly in the public sector, certainly value their staff, look after their staff, their well-being, but also how we use technology to work remotely, to make the most of technological advances to have more balance in our lives, and also work in a more sophisticated way. And I think for our schools and trusts on the line, redefine the relationship they have with parents and communities as well, much more involved, much more of a dialogue, perhaps more accountability. There are lots of opportunities in this crisis, and some of those I've just mentioned. And what you're saying is now the time for leaders to set some big ambitious goals and to focus on, we're almost back to that sphere of control a little bit. So whilst there's a lot involved in this crisis that we can't control yet or change, there are some things that we can be quite ambitious about. And your message, your lessons from Max and Bernie and others is to move quickly, to bring people together, and to be openly ambitious about that.
Yeah, actually, Michael, on this point, what I would say is that, I mean, this is just a personal point. I don't know if it reflects some of the listeners' thinking as well, but I have an incredibly busy career and life. I never have a dull moment. I'm constantly on the move. A lot of pressure, a lot of stuff to deal with, constantly at meetings and traveling, and quite often over the years, I've really wished that I could just have a break from it all to do a bit of thinking and to plan for the future. I never seem to have enough thinking and planning time. And now we have been handed, in the middle of a crisis, something of a gift. And it is a gift of not having to go to work, not having to go to physical meetings, not having to chase our tails operationally because we're not allowed to. We're on lockdown. Now, it doesn't mean that we're sitting at home doing nothing, because I think we're all still keeping pretty busy. I know my office here at home is pretty busy each day, but there has never been a better time to rethink how we do things. I mean, there will never, hopefully, never be a repetition of this lockdown. And I suspect in the years to come, we will all look back and wonder, did we make the most of it? Did we just put on £10 and binge watch TV, or did we do a bit of stepping back and using this as an opportunity to think? I think there's a good friend of mine, Daniel Priestley, who you can find online. Daniel runs a number of excellent business initiatives, and he's quite a big thinker. I mean, Daniel has he put out a great tweet recently in which he said, someone in the middle of this lockdown will come up with a business idea that will make them $1 billion. And it was kind of a throwaway line, but I know exactly, he's completely right. This is going to be a moment of innovation. I think it's also very interesting to see Sky News carry out a poll of people in the UK and find that only 9% of people express a desire to go back to the way things were before coronavirus. 9%. 90% of us actually are seeing something happening at the moment that's causing us to reflect and pausing some of our thought processes. And I think, therefore, for so many of us, it's a question of re-examining the fact that for us, for our colleagues, for our suppliers, we're all spending more time at home with our families. We're engaging with family and friends. We're questioning, do we need that 2 or 3 hour commute a day? I'm certainly questioning, do I need to get as many flights as I get around the world? And it's also making us think, if we're going to travel from A to B to go and meet people, do we actually need to do that, undertake that journey? Because the technology is here for us to communicate, and to communicate in very, very real ways. Now, it is a different type of communication because, for example, I'm talking to you. I can't see any of the attendees today, so I don't have any of the body language cues that would enable me to know whether what I was saying was valuable enough. For all I know,
unnerving, isn't it?
For all I know, everyone could be, having a cup of tea and chatting to their wife or something. So that's a reality, or a husband, So the reality is that we lose all of those cues. But the point is, this is a fantastic opportunity for us all to step back and say, how would we like our worlds to be on the far side of this coronavirus? Because if we bring change in now, I don't think many people are going to push back against it, because most people are going to say, yes, this is the time to try new things, and there perhaps will be a new world on the other side of it, and maybe there will be beneficial things to come out of it from a health and well-being perspective for everyone.
Mark, we've got 5 minutes left, and I when we're thinking about making the most of crisis and achieving progress through crisis, just to contrast Imola 94 and the progress that came from that with, I think, the financial crisis of 2008. So we heard from David earlier about how his children's hospice had responded to 2008. Am I right in saying that Formula One is still, despite 2008, living with the legacy of not quite responding to that crisis with the opportunism it could have done, and with the strategic thinking it could have done? And why was that? And is it going to come to a head now?
You framed that question beautifully, Michael, because what happened in 2008 with the financial crisis led to the third wave of financial difficulty for Formula One and for all the constituent teams. Essentially, what happened in 2000, there was a thing called the dot-com bubble, which burst. So a lot of big particularly North American technology companies went out of business or had major problems, and so we lost a lot of sponsorship from the technology sector in 2000. 2005, tobacco sponsorship was banned, and that was, in some cases, up to 70% of the revenue for Formula One teams came from tobacco companies. And then in 2008, we had the financial crisis, and the financial crisis meant that all the banks pulled out their support for the industry, but also we lost a number of car manufacturers, etc. In overall terms, I think Formula One responded very well, but unlike what happened after the fatal accidents of Senna and Ratzenberger in 1994, what happened in 2008 was the response was dealt with individually. So the teams did not sit down together and say, how are we going to deal with the fallout of the financial crisis. The teams all addressed it separately. Some teams addressed it very well. So if you take a team like McLaren, they decided to diversify their business. So in other words, to move away from a sponsorship-based model into a model where they would sell technology, goods and services into industry. The Williams Formula One team did exactly the same team. Other teams joined them on that approach. Red Bull Racing developed a Red Bull Technologies business, again, selling technology, goods and services. And by the way, in case anyone wonders, what technologies do Formula One teams sell into industry? We sell technology into automotive, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, aerospace, defense. I mean, I could spend an hour telling you the amazing technology solutions that are sold into industry, and that is one reason why in the coronavirus crisis, the Formula One teams have been able to put together Project Pit Lane, in which we are manufacturing ventilator components and continuous pressure airway systems, continuous positive airway pressure systems, CPAP machines, to assist in the fight against COVID-19. So in fact, the Mercedes-Benz team has repurposed an entire factory towards developing and manufacturing breathing aids. We're able to do that because in the wake of 2008, we learned how to repurpose our capability to sell technology solutions into industry. So that was an extremely positive outcome from 2008, and the legacy of that is seeing us in good stead today in 2020 with the COVID-19 crisis. However, there were also examples where teams just focused on the negative outcome of the financial crisis. They were all bleeding cash. Some of them suffered serious financial headaches. We subsequently had some teams which went out of business. And when you look at the reasons why they went out of business, they didn't go out of business because of the financial crisis. They went out of business because they were poorly led, because they didn't respond with agility and adaptability to the crisis that was facing them. The teams which adapted, the teams which embraced change, the teams which said, okay, this is the new normal and we have to approach it in a different way, those are the teams that succeeded. The teams that said, oh, let's just sit on our hands and wait for everything to go back to normal, it was never going to happen, and sure enough it didn't. So again, our lesson from that period of time was, when change comes upon you, don't waste any time complaining about it. Just say, okay, we're all in the same boat. Let's make the most of it, and let's galvanize our operations into thinking about where we can drive value and use our smarts, use our collective intelligence to come up with new ways of responding. And that thinking, that adaptive, agile thinking, will lead to very exciting opportunities, which will, I am sure, cause people in future years to look back and say, well, COVID-19 was a huge global catastrophe, but actually there were some good things that came out of it in terms of our ways of thinking and our approach to doing business.
Mark, it's been fascinating to listen to this morning, now into the afternoon, and to hear how another sector, another industry, Formula One, very complex sector, very much under the spotlight as well, in a different way, but still under the spotlight, like education is responding. And I think a number of lessons to come from this: the importance of seeing the ways in which we can make progress and reform and create a better future out of crisis, but also in doing so, the importance of working together and collaborating. And I think one of the things we've done well in the education sector so far is to see trusts and school leaders collaborating. I think from a regulatory point of view, we need to see more in the way of conversations. And it was interesting how you talked about the FIA, the regulator, working with the teams, working with the commercial rights holders and so on. So I think that's something we can certainly take away. But also a big message is avoiding the noise as much as possible, the speculation, and identifying this theme from the whole morning, really, which is staying in our circle of control and starting from that place with positivity, with ambition, and with a collaborative mindset. So I think it's been really valuable to hear you talk about the sport and how it's responding. Really valuable to hear about those leadership lessons from the past, and also how people adapted in 2008. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens next, and to keep in touch with you about how you and Formula One continue to respond. I think we will also go away and take some of those lessons away, and think about how, as working with the regulator, working with one another, we can help to shape that more positive future as well. But thanks so much for your time. I'm just seeing if there are any questions or comments for Mark before we say goodbye.
Well, can I just say thanks to you, Michael, for inviting me on this morning. I was so pleased to see most people stayed on to listen to me talking to you. It's always a good sign when people aren't logging off. And I'm very happy to answer questions subsequently. I mean, if there's any specific questions, Michael, you can send them through to me, and I'm very happy to provide written replies to any questions that that come through. And can I just say, as a final note, I come from a family of teachers. Both my sisters, both my brother-in-laws, and indeed a sister-in-law were teachers, and including head teachers. And so as a family, we recognize the huge effort that goes into education and into helping young people to be the best they can be and to benefit from education. So all I can say is, well done to all of you for what you're doing. And I'm sure that through your combined efforts, the generation that you're responsible for will come to benefit from all of the hard work that's going in at the moment to dealing with this crisis, and hopefully coming out the far side even stronger. So well done to all of you, and don't forget to give yourselves a pat on the back despite all of the crisis around us at the moment.
Thank you, Mark. And it never ceases to amaze me, really, the parallels between different sectors, and including Formula One, particularly at the moment, but I think we constantly see them. So no, it's been great to have you this morning. Thank you for joining us, and keep in touch.
Thank you very much
so
indeed.
Colleagues, I promised